My name is Khalid. I'm Dean of the School of Education at UNC Chapel Hill. And I want to welcome you to this talk on behalf of the school and our partner in crime, Chris Faison, who is coordinator of the UNC Men of Color Engagement in the Center for Student Success and Academic Counseling in the College of Arts and Sciences. Chris, this has been an incredibly wonderful partnership working on this with you. It is a distinct privilege and pleasure to welcome Professor James D. Anderson to the UNC Chapel Hill campus. I literally can spend the whole time dedicated to this lecture to talk about Jim. However, this means I will be the person standing between you and the talk, a position I'm not going to put myself in. I would want to put some comments here, and I'll be brief. I will start with the official blurb that you can locate on the web, and then follow with a couple of anecdotes with the hope of capturing some of Jim's scholarly stature and achievements, as well as impacts which surely go beyond academia. Start with the official blurb. Professor James D. Anderson is the Edward, William, and J. Marr Gutgsell Professor of Education and Dean of the College of Education at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Come to think about it, Jim, you and I became deans. You became dean at Illinois. I became dean here about the same time. That's the only thing on which we're equal. From there on, there's no comparison. While he is too humble to say it, to my mind, and to a whole host of others, Jim is the foremost authority on the history of African American education in the South and the history of higher education desegregation. He's also written extensively on the history of public school desegregation and the history of African American school achievement in the 20th century. His book, that has changed Chris's perspective, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935, which, by the way, was published by the University of North Carolina Press, which is a good win for us, has been called seminal work, a classic, and a must-read. The book has accumulated a number of accolades over the years, including the 1989 Outstanding Book Award from the Gustav Myers Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights in North America, 1989 Critics' Choice Award, American Educational Studies Association, and in 1990 the Outstanding Book Award from the American Educational Research Association, AERA, which is the largest national and international association for educators in the world. Jim also is senior editor of the History of Education Quarterly. He served as an advisor for and participant in the PBS documentaries School and the Story of American Public Education, 2001, The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow in 2002, and in 2007, Forgotten Genius, the Percy Julian Story. Professor Anderson has served as an expert witness in a series of federal desegregation and affirmative action cases, including Jenkins versus Missouri, to which I will return in a minute, Knight versus Alabama, Ayers versus Mississippi, Gratz versus Bollinger, and Grother versus Bollinger, some really high-profile cases. Jim was elected to the National Academy of Education in 2008. In 2012, he was elected as a fellow for outstanding research by the American Educational Research Association and received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. In 2013, he was selected Center for Advanced Study Professor of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Just so that you know, the Center for Advanced Study includes people like who, invented theories in physics and chemistry. It's a great, great honor on the Illinois campus. I want to move and just talk about a few anecdotes that I'd like to share with you. First of all, it's not an overstatement to say that Jim is an institution. He came for graduate studies to Illinois in 1966 and saved a short 3-year stint at Indiana University Bloomington, to which he went after he finished his PhD in Illinois. He came back and has been at Illinois ever since. Now what this means is, in 2017, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign celebrated its sesquicentennial. That's 150 years. Now I know for you at UNC Chapel Hill, This is like a startup university, but 150 years is a lot of time. And the saying goes on the Illinois campus is that UIUC, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, has been around for 150 years, and Jim Anderson has been there for 1/3 of the time. He literally has hundreds of intellectual children and grandchildren, many of whom have studied under Jim, got their PhDs, and have gone to carve out distinguished careers within academia and beyond, including presidents of universities and directors of major research institutes around the nation. Jim has been called a leader of leaders, a teacher of teachers, an educator of educators. When I came to Illinois in the year 2000, and I joined the Department of Curriculum and Instruction as a second-year assistant professor in the College of Education, Jim was there. In 2016, 16 years later, when I left Illinois as the college's Associate Dean for Research to join Carolina here as Dean of the School of Education, Jim was there. And in those 16 years, he was a consistent supporter, mentor, and guide, and above all, a friend to me and to countless many others. Second, Jim has made the pursuit of equity and social justice the center focus for his scholarship and, more importantly, public engagement work. In a recent piece released by Illinois, he was aptly called the Dream Keeper. I really encourage you to look up the website of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and read the story Dream Keeper to get a sense of what Jim has achieved over his 50 years at Illinois. But let me give you a couple of facts. Illinois, that university, has about 2,000 tenure-line faculty members. That's when I was there. But Illinois boasts being the most diverse of the Big Ten. Those are 15 big universities in terms of faculty diversity. I did the calculations at one point in time, and the College of Education, and its best days, we were 100 faculty members, accounts for 20% of the diversity on the Illinois campus. Just do the math on that. A few years ago, Jim's own department, Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership, graduated in a single year 10 African American women with a PhD in equal. We call them the Fabulous 10. For those who understand, yes, there you go. For those who understand how hard it is not only to access higher ed for minority students and minority faculty and get them through their programs to succeed and have careers, we really appreciate what this means. But I encourage you to check out the numbers. Third, and I think that's incredibly important, Jim has had a tangible and substantial impact on the education and well-being of school students and their families. As the plaintiff's key expert witness in Jenkins versus State of Missouri, a case that dates back to the 1984, a very complex case, Jim's testimony, he was the star witness, as they say, which drew on his historical scholarship, some of which he will share with us today, was pivotal to winning that case. This case resulted in a judgment that directed $500 million, $500 million, to the Kansas City School District and the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the city to start to address some of the historical injustices suffered by minority students, mostly African American students, and their families as a result of the discriminatory practices related to desegregation against those students and their families. And to my mind, this goes to show how mistaken those who keep saying that studying in the humanities and the history does not pay. I think it paid quite a bit in this time. Finally, the talk that we asked Jim to deliver here today, which is titled A Long Shadow, the American Pursuit of Political Justice and Education Equality, we specifically asked Jim to deliver this talk, which draws on a very famous talk he gave back in 2014, which was the 11th annual ADRA Brown Lecture, a very distinguished lecture. We asked him to start there and sort of update us. And I know for a fact that that talk is very important. And let me tell you how I know. So over the years, I've invited Jim to come and give talks at different places. And he said, what do you want me to talk? And I say about this. He said, okay, Then he shows up, no notes, no PowerPoint presentation, and he would give the most coherent, substantive lecture you could ever think of or cognitive for. Now, we know for a fact that Jim worked out the PowerPoint for this one. But more importantly, why I know this is important is that I have it on a good source that before going to give this talk in DC for the Brown lecture, Jim Anderson was seen practicing this talk near his hotel room more than once. I did not share this with you, but you know that on good source. It tells you how important this is. So please, join me in welcoming James D. Anderson, my friend, to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I was at my office in Champaign, and he called, and when he was there, we were great colleagues, great friends, and what I liked about the relationship is that we could get a lot of serious work done with a sense of humor. We never did take ourselves too seriously and work well together. And so it was our regret when you were able to steal him away from Champaign. And it's a good chance to see him. My first taste of Lebanese food was in his home, cooked by his wife, Lama. And over the years, we worked extremely well together. So I'm very pleased to be here. I must apologize because I should have sent a lot of emails before I got here. But I'm learning that in the deanship role, you just rush, and then you take off. And so I have a lot of friends and colleagues in this area, and I didn't send a single email. I'm happy that General McNeil is here. Professor McNeil I've known since she came out of graduate school at the University of Chicago, and he was mentioning the case in Kansas City. Professor Ted Shaw was my attorney in that case, and actually I had been called as an expert witness in the St. Louis deseg case, and I knew I was first up as a historian. And on the day that I was supposed to go on the witness stand, they went into a room and reached a settlement. And I didn't have to go on the witness stand, and I said, there is a God. So I got to Kansas City with Ted Shaw and his group, and I'm thinking, you know, I just might luck out again. You know, they had some big time, and see the Legal Defense Fund and the group out of DC, big time law firm that was working there. No, they'll be able to reach a settlement. Not that time. And the other question was, okay, there's 16 or 17 suburban districts here. So I thought the judge would say, let's just get one attorney to represent the suburban districts to cross-examine you. No. All 16, 17, whatever, was able to cross-examine me. And I was on the witness stand for 3 days, and I came back to Champaign and I said, every professor should have this experience, because if there's anything that will humble you, it's being cross-examined for 3 days. And I was kind of surprised we won. George Clark from the Ozarks that wore this belt, cowboy belt and boots. I'm thinking, we're not going to win this case, but they had a wonderful team. They actually had a dream team to win this case, and I think it was one of the pivotal cases. So I enjoyed, learned a lot, and I did have some cases after that, but that was the one that really stands out. We were just talking about it, how young we were when it happened. This was over 30-some years ago, but it's in the books now. Anyway, thanks for inviting me here. I have a colleague in Champaign who's been there 30-some years, William Trent, who's a graduate of your sociology department, got his PhD, and he always say to me that you should go and get a slice of heaven, as he refers to this place. So I'm happy to be here. Right. I kind of changed the title a bit away from. I will take a lot of questions about education equality, but it was really education equality. Really a study of the pursuit of education equality that got me involved in this kind of talk, and it has changed a bit. To be more general about the pursuit of freedom and equality, I'm taking the terms from, of course, the civil rights movement. People call it civil rights, but I always remember the sign said freedom and equality every time you had those signs up. And I thought that actually is the appropriate way to frame it, pursuit of freedom and equality. But education got me started because there was this article that I read. It was the first issue of the Journal of Negro Education, and the lead article was by Horace Mann Bond, who was a very preeminent historian of African American education, certainly my hero in the history of African American education, and also the father of Julian Bond. But he wrote this article, and I'm reading it, and he's talking about equality in the period from 1868 to the turn of the century to 1900. And he says that that in 1900, and he mentioned my state where I was born and raised, Alabama, that the African American children in the state of Alabama got more of the school fund than the white kids. And I was like, that's counterintuitive. And that I was questioning that. That didn't happen, because my assumption was the farther you went back to slavery, the worse it was. And so I'm asking myself, how could they have more equality in this time period than they would in the next 30 years, and even more than I had when I was coming through elementary and high school in Greene County, Alabama. And so I decided to run a test case to say, this can't be true. So I took the counties where I grew up in the Black Belt of Alabama, where, there's few areas more Jim Crow than that area. And Montgomery was there, George Wallace was there, Selman was there. The Black Panther Party was founded in Lowndes County. So it's an area where it was kind of the cradle of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and SCLC. So I thought to use that as a test case. And turns out he was right, as I used every measure from school terms to teachers' pay to all kinds of measures. In each one of the metrics, there was equality in terms of their share of the school fund. And it did last roughly from 1868 until the turn of the century. And then it changed very dramatically. And I finally realized that the big change was the disenfranchisement of African Americans, that the quality was profoundly and powerfully connected to enfranchisement. So when they had the right to vote, and they were serving on local, state boards of education, they were elected to state assemblies, even a small group elected to the US House and the Senate, that when African Americans played that role in the Reconstruction era, they were able to use that political power and even the potential of their vote to gain a lot of equality for themselves. And as you know, there were at least 3 states in which you had an African American majority: South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And then there were the several states where there was a near majority, like Alabama and Florida and Georgia. So these were places where an enfranchised African American population could leverage their enfranchisement for a lot of advantages, including education equality. Even the Tuskegee Institute, which people always say was founded by Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee was actually a deal that was made between a white candidate for the Alabama state legislature and the African American population in Macon County, where they decided, we will vote for you in return for a normal school. So it actually started out as a public normal school and then became private later on. But these were the kinds of things that African Americans could leverage through enfranchisement. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at, is this pursuit. But the story is that Reconstruction started out in that way, and it was, even though there's a lot of work on Reconstruction as a failure, it was kind of a glorious moment in American history and a time when people saw the birth of a new freedom. And I want to look at the connections between the issues that were debated and compromised and voted upon in that time period, and really to think about its connection to the issues that we deal with today that stem directly from that time period. Now, This is historians see this as the second founding, and for good reason. And there have been a couple of legislators who have formed a group, and they've asked the National Park Service to think about a legacy and sites to recognize the second founding. And it's amazing that the second founding, which abolished slavery, which has to be one of the greatest contributions that this country ever made to freedom, was the emancipation of 4 million people, passed the 14th Amendment. And how much do we count on that amendment? But almost everything having to deal with issues of equality, whether it's Brown v. Board of Education, whether it's Levin versus Virginia, whether it's Fisher versus Texas, whether it's same-sex marriage. There are so many issues of equality that go back to the second founding that frames a new idea and a new constitution for American democracy. And of course, the 15th Amendment expanding the right of franchise to all males without, irrespective of race, creed, or color. And issues of citizenship for the first time is defined in the Constitution in the 14th Amendment, and due process, as well as equal protection under the law. So that's an interesting and dramatic and profoundly impactful time in American history. But there are no sites. Think about it. There are no sites. The National Park Service have sites of the Civil War, all kinds of monuments, but there are no sites for this. And you have to ask ourselves, why would there be no sites for the second founding that ended slavery, passed the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, defined citizenship, and framed the Constitution in a way that reflects our contemporary democracy? Now, the original Constitution, of course, equality is not even in there. The only time equal is in there is simply to say that each state would have equal representation in the upper house, 2 senators. That's the only reference to equality. And of course, we know why it could not reference equality. It was because of slavery. And the Reconstruction people knew this, and they saw this as a time when they could change things. I'm looking up here. So, now, the way I got started on this was that on the sesquicentennial of Dred Scott, I was looking at Dred Scott to give a talk, and I knew that there was a very strong reaction against the Dred Scott decision in 1857, in which the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, whether slave or free, were not citizens of the United States. And I also knew that there was outrage in many parts of the country, particularly Republican newspapers, about this decision. And also knew that it was repealed by the 14th Amendment with the Citizenship Clause, all persons born and naturalized. So what I wanted to know, just in a more up close and personal way, what happened in details? How did African Americans move from being non-citizens to being citizens of the United States, and what were the details, what were the compromises, what were the debates and so forth. So I got started on this, and I think and I got started on this, and I realized that I wanted to track the 14th Amendment. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to track it into its incorporation to the Constitution. And so I'm following this rubric in the Congressional Globe on civil rights, because I assume that the 14th Amendment that we know is a civil rights amendment. And I followed this for months, only to realize that I was actually tracking the 1866 Civil Rights Act. And then I thought, well, where's the 14th Amendment? Well, the 14th Amendment was not a civil rights amendment in its origins. It was an apportionment amendment. And it made sense to me. because once slavery was abolished, the only portion of the Constitution that the Reconstruction Congress was compelled to repeal was the 3/5 clause, because it was predicated on slavery. And with the abolition of slavery, the 3/5 clause was null and void. So they had to develop a new amendment simply explaining, or at least prescribing, apportionment, meaning that they have to have a new formula for determining how many seats each state get into the House of Representatives. You know, the 3/5 clause was that every state would get its whole population, its indentured servants, and 3/5 of the slave population. Once that's destroyed, then they have to change the Constitution. So the initial 14th Amendment was about apportionment. Now, I actually came up on it. It was the 13th Amendment, because it actually started before the ratification of the 13th Amendment had occurred. And then I realized that the Reconstruction Congress viewed this time, and why it's called the Second Founding, they viewed this time as a chance to correct the mistakes of what we call the Founding Fathers, but they called the Fathers. They were that young. they were born in 1810, and so they always said the Fathers. They never said Founding Fathers, always the Fathers. But they were very, very specific, and in some ways outraged about the mistake of the Founding Fathers. And what they said was that the American Constitution was supposed to be the organic law of the Declaration of Independence. And they actually, the Reconstruction, the leaders of the Reconstruction, people like Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens and others, they viewed the Declaration of Independence as the basis for American law. And from their viewpoint, and they were very upset about it, and they said it again and again, that the Fathers failed to establish the Constitution based upon the Declaration of Independence. And they explained why. And you could see some of the comments from people like Sumner, and this is Thaddeus Stevens, really in a very long quote, portions of it is here, but he's simply saying that when the Founding Fathers, or in that case the Fathers, went to establish the Constitution, he said this serpent from hell came up and obstructed all of their intents so that they could not follow their principles. So, and that was said again and again by the Congress. You can see the same thing from Sumner as well, and others. So they saw this as an opportunity to make a profound correction of the American Constitution and to create a democracy that the Founding Fathers failed to create. And early on, they started with this amendment. This was one of the first versions of the 14th Amendment from Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stephenson. And it was simply, all national and state laws shall be equally applicable to every citizen, and no discrimination shall be made on account of race or color. There are 7 versions of this amendment that's being proposed by different ones. And they're saying specifically that the American Constitution should be a constitution in which there will be no discrimination on account of race or color. Another amendment comes, and I think this is George Boutwell of Massachusetts, this amendment. And then the one from John Henderson from Missouri is an interesting one. John Henderson had been a slaveholder, and he had gotten rid of his slaves, and now he was making very progressive proposals to amend the Constitution. And his amendment is the most progressive when you think about it. He says, no state in prescribing the qualifications requisite for electors therein shall discriminate against any person on account of color or race. Here's what he's saying here. He's saying that we shouldn't allow the states to fix the qualification of voters. And in his comments, he says, for 80 years, going back to the original Constitution, we allowed the states to fix the qualifications of voters. And now he wants to amend the Constitution so that can't happen anymore. Because he, as well as the other leaders at this point, it's about 7 to 10 of them, recognize that at some point, the southern states will be readmitted to the Union. And once they're readmitted, they anticipated that they would disenfranchise the African American population because the states had control of the elective franchise. And they would figure out some way to disenfranchise black voters. So the amendment was to make sure that they move control of the franchise from the states to the federal government in that. And there are a number of these amendments, and let me go back. Now what happens to this, and I'll go through this, is that none of these amendments pass the Senate or the House. And the lopsided defeat is what I mean by the long shadow. You can see that Charles Sumner's proposal was defeated by a vote of 38-7. Henderson's proposal was defeated by a vote of 37-10. And Richard Yates, who also proposed a similar one, was defeated by a vote of 38-7. So I have colleagues and some historians, as well as a friend on the court, Clarence Thomas, who makes the point that we have a colorblind constitution. These were the amendments for a colorblind constitution, and every one of them was defeated. Now, it was interesting to see what did they discuss? What comments did they make once these amendments were defeated? And it was interesting because there was this sense of confessions and regrets. It's like they weren't trying to hide it. Yeah. And they weren't saying we defeated these things because they didn't make any sense. They were really saying we defeated them because we didn't have the courage to follow through. And one of the interesting ones is Jacob Harwood of Michigan, who was one of the key framers of the 14th Amendment. And at one point he came to the floor of the Senate and just simply said, I am sorry to be obliged to acknowledge it, that this section of the amendment does not recognize the authority of the United States over the question of suffrage in the several states. Nor does it recognize, much less secure, the right of suffrage to the colored race. We may as well state it plainly and fairly, so there shall be no misunderstanding on the subject. It was our opinion that 3/4 of the states of this union could not be induced to vote to grant the right of suffrage, even in any degree or under any restrictions to the colored race. Now you think, this is 1866. And people, at least the history I got early on, was that Reconstruction failed because the Compromise of 1877, and that they withdrew federal troops from the South, and it all fell apart. But these leading senators, as well as House of Representatives, even before the 14th Amendment is framed, is telling us that they planted the seeds of African American disfranchisement. Yeah. So now I would add that African Americans didn't get the memo right away. So they proceeded to go to the Reconstruction conventions to participate and to take part in that. But eventually, as we now know, African Americans were disenfranchised. And this is a long shadow that they cast over freedom and equality in America when they failed to pass these amendments to the Constitution. Because, as we know, and I'm moving forward in time now because I want to make the connection between what they did in 1866 and what we faced in 1966 or 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. That, and this has to do with the disenfranchisement of African American voters across, particularly the South. And what I'm looking at now is these counties in the Black Belt where you had the March on Selma and SCLC and so forth, and the DOJ, Department of Justice, as they approached the 1965 Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and they were recognizing the upheaval in the South, the murders, the boycotts and so forth, and they started to collect information on suffrage and on voting in these areas. And I decided to look at what they collected in this area where much of the activities took place. And here's what Jacob Howard and others projected. This is a century later. And this is the voter registration in the Black Belt counties of Alabama. You can see a percentage of black voters that are voting. My county is Greene County. I think it's like 2.5% that's voted. But appalling, there are counties like Lowndes and Wilcox where no African Americans are voting. It's 0%. And then you move over to the percentage of white voting population, and there are a number of counties where it's above 100%. And yet there's no commissions to look at voter fraud. But this is what the Reconstruction legislators anticipated, and when they couldn't get the Constitution amended in such a way there could be no discrimination on account of race and color, and they would remove the control of elective franchise from the states to the federal Constitution, this is what they anticipated. This is the shadow that they saw. And of course, this is what happened. Yeah. Now, this is interesting because the Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach at the time, who headed up this study, at the end of it, when he had all these findings, he actually, in his notes, proposed an amendment that's strikingly similar to the one of 1865 and 1866, where he said we needed a constitutional amendment to prohibit the states from imposing any qualification or disqualifications for voting in the federal or state elections, other than age, residence, felony, and commitment to a mental institution. So here he was, 100 years later, calling for the same kind of amendment that had failed in 1866, because he now could see retrospectively what was the results of that failure. I won't spend too much time on this because you can see the connections now. This is why state after state, I think I mentioned this state in there a little bit, but Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and North Carolina, is not just Alabama anymore. It's not just Mississippi and Georgia. That state after state is fixing the qualifications of voters to disenfranchise not only African Americans, but other voters of color as well. Here's what we had in 2012, just the effects of voter ID alone. That 25% of African American voters are disenfranchised. 20% of Asians, 19% of Latinos, and down the line, just on voter ID. Now, voter ID is not the only mechanism they use to disenfranchise voters. One of the ones they used was changing the days on which you could vote. And within the African American community, they had this souls to the polls, where on the Sunday before that Tuesday, they would carry people to the polls to vote. In the election, I think it was the 2008 election, the first Obama election, on the Sunday before that Tuesday, 1/3 of all the votes that were cast in America were cast by African Americans on that Sunday. 1/3 of all the votes that were cast. And state after state eliminated that Sunday from voting. Yeah. And that goes back to what the Reconstruction legislators saw, that if you leave it to the states to control the elective franchise, this is the sort of thing they can do, and they can do with a lot of immunity because it's consistent with their constitutional right, unless you do what they did here, where the court said it was targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision, as you can see. But in the case of Texas, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that 600,000 would be disenfranchised, and most of them would be black and Latino as well. That. So that is just one of the shadows that are cast by the Reconstruction government. The other question I want to go to is citizenship, which is interesting because, and there are others, but I just wanted to talk about voting and citizenship because these two really do resonate with echoes of the Reconstruction. On citizenship, I thought when I would track it through that there's going to be a lot of heated debate repealing the Dred Scott decision as to whether African Americans would be citizens of the United States. But then I realized Republicans had completely taken over, about 80% of the Congress now, House and Senate, and these were the same voices that were horrified by the Dred Scott decision. And so at first it's in the 1866 Civil Rights Bill Act, that all persons born and naturalized as citizens, and then they put it into the 14th Amendment. In fact, when the 14th Amendment stalled and they couldn't get the apportionment thing done, they simply took portions of the 1866 Civil Rights Act and incorporated that as part of the 14th Amendment, and there wasn't much heated debate as to whether African Americans would now be citizens. There were a few like Garrett Davis from Kentucky, from the border states, that raised questions as to whether African Americans should, but it was overwhelming, there's no doubt about it. But the debate was over Native Americans, not over African Americans. It was over Native Americans. Now, in the 1866 Civil Rights Bill, it says all persons born or naturalized are not subject to a foreign power or Indians not taxed. Now, Indians not taxed was an old phrase that they used. And what it meant literally that above 90% of Native Americans were excluded from the census in 1790 and from other things, and from the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that they were excluded. Indians not taxed was another euphemism for uncivilized Indians. And so there was a small portion of Indians that were taxed and considered to be civilized, but the vast majority of them were excluded. When it came to the 14th Amendment, they had this debate over whether this phrase was appropriate. And they began to say, it doesn't make any sense. Suppose someone is not taxed today and taxed tomorrow. So they were trying to find the appropriate phrase to replace Indians not taxed. And they settled on the phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, arguing that Native Americans were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States government, which was a false argument, because they had quasi-nation status. So that goes into the 14th Amendment. Yeah, I remember reading and had no idea what that phrase meant. All persons born and naturalized and not subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Okay. And they made it very clear that this phrase was there to exclude Native Americans from citizenship. Now, It's no question that for African American citizenship, and except for the Native Americans that were excluded, that Congress intended to make this ironclad. Even though, and I'll come back to this, because in both the voting rights case and the citizenship case, there is a strong connection between the past and the present. As you know, there are hot, pretty intense debates about who deserves to be a citizen and who belongs and who can be a citizen of the United States today. Well, we go through that. There was a point in the debate of the 14th Amendment between James Doolittle and Jacob Howard from Michigan, Doolittle from Wisconsin. And Doolittle was saying, we don't need to put this into the 14th Amendment. It's in the 1866 Civil Rights Bill, leave it there. And Howard gave him this response. He said, we desired to put the question of citizenship and the rights of citizens and the freedmen under the Civil Rights Bill, that is, taking that clause in the Civil Rights Bill, beyond the legislative power of such a gentleman as a senator from Wisconsin, who would pull the whole system up by the roots and destroy it and expose the freedmen again to the oppressions of their old masters. This is what makes birthright citizenship ironclad, is that they made it very clear they were putting birthright citizenship beyond the power of Congress to do anything about it. And the only way Congress could do something about it was to repeal the 14th Amendment, have a new amendment passed by 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and ratified by 2/3 of the state. Other than that, birthright citizenship is ironclad, except for some people. There are people who, led by Tancredo and Deal, who think that it's not ironclad. Now, some people want to repeal the 14th Amendment, including Pete Wilson of California, who asked for the repeal of the 14th Amendment. The topic today is very clear. They're trying to prevent the children born of undocumented immigrants from being citizens of the United States of America. Because under the 14th Amendment, they are citizens under the birthright clause. So they're trying to figure out some way to do that. Now, they think that the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof is a way and a loophole to preclude the children of undocumented immigrants from being citizens. But what they don't realize is that that phrase is in the 14th Amendment, not for undocumented immigrants, it's in there for Native Americans. And it hasn't changed. Congress passed the American Indian Citizenship Act in 1924 as a way around this. But that constitutional phrase, that clause, and what it means is there, and it remains there. That there is no constitutional basis for the citizenship of Native Americans. And when you think about the clause that's used to establish the citizenship of African Americans, all persons born, there's no more native-born population than Native Americans, and yet it doesn't apply to them. Now, I think it can say that children born of undocumented immigrants are not citizens of the United States, will show up again and again in congressional legislation, and also will be tried in some ways in the courts, because there are some people think the loophole in the 14th Amendment that their parents brought them here, they didn't have free choice to become citizens, and therefore they're not subject to the jurisdiction thereof of the United States. That is likely to continue as well. I think if there is, what I take from this is that the second founding created an opportunity to create a very different kind of democracy and a very different kind of constitution, and one that would serve us well today. But the conversations that they had then are the conversation that we have to go back to. We just can't let them die on citizenship, on the right to vote, or the elective franchise. And there are other aspects of this on equality of opportunity and due process as well, that the kind of constitution they sought to create and failed to do so is the kind of constitution that we should take up and think seriously about creating that constitution that they felt regretfully, that they were unable to pass. So I'll stop here and see if you have questions or comments.
Chris will run the mic too,
okay,
so that we can keep recording of this. Just one press on the button. Yeah, that's right. All right.
Thank you again, Dr. Anderson, for coming and sharing with us. What light do you see ahead?
So what?
What light do you see ahead, given the 160 years of this going on?
Yeah.
What are the bright spots moving forward?
I think it's a good question. I think for most of us, the kind of democracy that we value is very much the kind of democracy that they weren't able to get through. I mean, the way we think about equality and freedom, the way we think about equal rights, the way we think about the right to vote, the way we think about citizenship, the way we think about this in general has come through us not through the Constitution, but through acts like the Congressional Act, 1964 Civil Rights Act, or the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1924 American Indian Citizenship Act, that Congress has moved to put in place congressional acts in place of a Constitution that accomplished the same thing. But we also know the consequence of this. Voting Rights Act is a good example. What changed those numbers up there that we saw was the empowering of federal registers to come into the South and to register people to vote. It was actually what was being proposed in 1866, that the elective franchise would be controlled by the United States of America. And so they came into those counties, the southern states, and they registered African Americans to vote and did not allow the states to control the elective franchise and disenfranchise them. So that is something that we value, but then the Supreme Court came back and pretty much gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and that would put us right back where we were in 1866. And I think most people would actually frown on anything that is practically equivalent to the Three-Fifths Compromise, because Congress tried to change that with the Apportionment Act in 1865, 1866. But when you think about it, if a state counts its populations of color, whether it's African American or Latinos, you know, Texas may be an example where it's 43% white and you know, majority people of color state. But the seats in the House of Representatives from that state is based on that entire population. What they didn't like about the Three-Fifths Clause was that the southern states got seats in the House and people could not vote because they were slaves. So if we have anything akin to that today, where a state is counting its African American population or its Latino population for seats in the House of Representatives and then disenfranchising them, that's the Three-Fifths Compromise all over again. Because they're not voting, but they're being counted for seats in the House. I think most people would object to that. You know, I think most of them would, if not all. So the hope, the light ahead would be to return to these important conversations, these important debates, and frame them in terms of our norms and values of today. I mean, they couldn't get it through, but even as I say that, I'm thinking about the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, that fell short of one state, I believe, is, you know, just an amendment to the Constitution saying there will be no discrimination based on sex. You know, and that could not pass, could not be ratified by 3/4 of the states. I don't know what would happen today if you tried to get an equality amendment passed and ratified by the states, but it's worth a try. It's worth reminding the nation that maybe in 1866 they couldn't get 3/4 of the states to put into the Constitution that there would be no discrimination on account of race or color. But can we do it today? And if we can't, we need to know, and need to know why.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Anderson. I wanted to ask about the role that you believe education plays in bringing about some of the changes that you mentioned that will benefit our society. Specifically regarding civics education. So when young people grow up learning the dominant narrative that America is becoming fairer and fairer every single day, and it's been this constant march toward progress, it doesn't quite highlight some of the things that you mentioned of how the Constitution and lawmakers often fall short of full equality. So without an accurate understanding of where we are as a country, how can students get inspired and encouraged and really have the understanding that there's still plenty of fights left to move toward equality? What role do you believe education plays in that?
I think education, I am one person who thinks we do need a new civic education, and it needs to deal with issues that are critical, issues of equality, issues of social justice. I don't know about your education, but I went through an education where these things were abstracted to the point they had no meaning. What's 3/5 compromise? It didn't mean anything. 14th Amendment didn't mean anything. And even if you could recite it, never paid attention to the clause subject to the jurisdiction thereof. I didn't know that it excluded Native Americans from citizenship. If I had known that, that would have been of concern to me. How could you exclude the indigenous populations from being citizens in this country? That might have been a point for discussion, for understanding, and get a sense of the attitude. I didn't go into any of the debates or share the opinions that they had at the time, but they are really interesting when you hear them explaining why Chinese should not be citizens of the United States. And they also went after gypsies, why they shouldn't be citizens of the United States. And with Native Americans, I followed the debate very closely. And one of the things, I was like, why? Because there were other senators asking, now that we are building a more liberal constitution, why would you exclude Native Americans? They kept saying, why? Well, one of the reasons was that, and something we have a lot of talk about, if they were citizens, they'd have access to the Second Amendment. Think about it. And that's the one thing, they did not want them to have access, as much as we seem to value that. It's like we need to exclude Native Americans from the right to bear arms. And so that comes up in the debate. And so it's that part of civics, that part of change, that part of history that you just don't get when you're coming through. And I don't think that that is so horrifying, and that people of a high school age can't hear that, listen to that, and have conversation and debates about it, even to role play, these particular voices by senators. The other thing I think should be part of our civic education I learned from this is that there is at least a cadre of people in the House and the Senate. When you look at the amendments they're proposing, they're very strongly anti-racist amendments. And they represent at least a tradition of anti-racism, which sometimes young people don't hear because they think that they have to choose between being slaves or masters, or segregationists and white supremacists, or the subject of that. And they missed the identification with people like Stevens and Sumner and others and Henderson, who are proposing to build a constitution where there would be no discrimination on the count of race or color, at a time. If you ask any civics class to name any individuals that proposed an anti-racist amendment to the Constitution at that time, you're probably not going to get any answers at all. But we need to bring this into our civic classes so that young people will have more to identify with than the people who disenfranchised the voters and who were the perpetrators of Jim Crow. there are other elements, even though they are a minority. It's a very powerful minority and a very insightful minority. And I think what's critical for me is that they reflect the kind of democracy that we value today.
So, may I?
Yes.
Thank you for this lecture and presentation. I spend a lot of time thinking about and teach, of course, in the 14th Amendment. I wanted to push a little bit in another direction with respect to, at least, I think, an understanding of the post-Civil War amendment. Because the issue of suffrage came up first after the Civil War with respect to the District of Columbia,
Yep.
and whether or not suffrage, as you know,
Right.
would be granted to African Americans in the District of Columbia. And during those debates and some of the other debates, there were many who said that they drew a distinction between suffrage as a political right and civil rights.
Yep.
We tend to think now, correctly, I think that the right to vote is also a civil right. But at that time, many people said it wasn't.
Right.
That was a political right.
Right.
And it was not included in the 14th Amendment. One of the reasons why the 15th Amendment in 1870, which granted or guaranteed the right to vote against racial discrimination effectively for, not effectively for males, it's the only
Right.
place in the Constitution where the word males appear, which was a great betrayal of women, many of whom, or some of whom were, battled for abolition and for suffrage for black folk. So I think in order to understand, at least for me, you have to understand those three amendments and the distinction between political and civil rights that existed at that time.
Right.
The other thing about the 14th Amendment, the 39th Congress, when it convened, as you know, did the Republicans explicitly excluded, when they did the roll call, the southern states.
Yep.
And they did it for obvious reasons. And supporting the right of citizenship and the 14th Amendment was essential to the post-Civil War agenda. And it wouldn't have happened
Right.
if the southern states had been represented in part because of the effects of the 3/5 ratio, which took the 14th Amendment, as you correctly point out, to undo. But I also think it's important to keep in mind that the three post-Civil War amendments are interlaced, and particularly the 13th and the 14th, and the 15th, of course, guaranteeing political rights and suffrage. Finally, on citizenship, Dred Scott was still good law. I don't mean good as a normative,
Right. Right.
value, but when I said good law, I mean effective. It was still in place after the Civil War, which is why the 14th Amendment necessarily, right out the box, said all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States in the state in which they reside.
Right.
And that citizenship piece was the primary purpose of the amendment as opposed to political rights, which came with the 15th Amendment. And so I just wanted to underscore that you're absolutely right that some of the folks in Congress now say that birthright citizenship ought to be repealed. I agree with your assessment that that ain't gonna happen.
Right.
But as a political matter, they are going to continue to push it. But Plyler versus Doe is still the law of the Supreme Court with respect to education. So I agree with you on that score.
There's a lot in the question, so let me try to handle them piece by piece. One, it's interesting with the DC thing because I followed that through, and I thought, because they quickly gave the elective franchise to DC. And I thought, well, that's because they don't have to change the Constitution to do that because DC is not a state. So it's already under federal authority. And so DC was the one that they handled first.
That's right.
But the rest of them forced them to deal with an 80-year-old constitutional provision where states had control of the elective franchise. And that one they failed to deal with. If I had really dealt with the equal protection, I would have actually followed up on, they not only subdivided rights into civil and political, they did three. They did social, civil, and political. And they put all of this stuff into social, like marriage and school segregation and public accommodation. And on the floor, they understood that if the 14th Amendment and its equal protection clause made unconstitutional interracial marriage or school segregation, because at the time only Massachusetts had abolished school segregation. They also knew that probate judges and officials across the nation, because in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that was a $1,000 fine, a lot of money in 1866, and up to 1 year in prison for the violation of those rights. So they had to say, well, and they would ask, does this amendment make unconstitutional the bans on interracial marriage? They said, oh no, that's a social right. Does this Constitution make this amendment make unconstitutional the segregation of schools where they're segregated in every state except Massachusetts? They said, no, that's a social right. They kept putting it into this bag of social right. Most of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. And then they separate political rights by saying that is the franchise, that's the right to vote. So what is the 14th Amendment? It said it's civil rights. Life, liberty, and protection of property. So they really did narrow the meaning of the 14th in that sense. I really do, I was wondering, why would they so easily pass the elective franchise to DC? Then I realized it's not a state. So it didn't require any change in the Constitution to do it.
Would you also just say a word about the necessity of the 14th Amendment as a constitutional amendment, given Andrew Johnson's veto of the 1866 Civil Rights Act,
right,
and his opposition to the post-Civil War amendments,
and
14th and the 15th.
Yeah, and one part of that was that because this was when they had this long debate about, once he vetoed 1866 Civil Rights, and at the point, really in May of 1866, when they couldn't get the apportionment amendment through and it stalled, then they switched to the 14th Amendment that we know. And that began to bring parts of the 1866 Civil Rights Act into the 14th Amendment. But they recognized that it had been vetoed and then was passed as the Congress overrode Andrew Johnson. And then they were thinking, so what if another Congress simply repealed the 1866 Civil Rights Act? And they thought the only way that we can guarantee citizenship is to bring it into the Constitution as part of the 14th Amendment. And then And it's interesting because, and I haven't done enough work on 1866, but it's interesting, the 1866 Civil Rights Act still stands, and it doesn't have a tenure. And it has all kinds of protections in there, but nonetheless, it's a congressional act, and they wanted to make sure that it would be in the Constitution.
Well, the statute couldn't have done it. The statute couldn't have overridden,
The Constitution.
couldn't have overridden Dred Scott.
Right.
It had
Yes.
to be a constitutional
Yeah.
amendment.
And that was the guy who was the attorney for Dred Scott before the Supreme Court was in the Congress at the time. I'm blocking on his name, but he was considered to be a great constitutional lawyer. And they asked him, you know, does Dred Scott still stand? He said, yes. There's nothing that overrules Dred Scott. And that's when they said, well, there's only one way to overrule Dred Scott, and that is to have a constitutional amendment defining citizenship.
Yeah,
But
Blair. I think you're talking about Blair.
yes, yeah. Now, the thing about it is that it's not just, even though let's talk about the freedmen, about African Americans, but that clause has served the whole nation. I mean, there are a lot of people who are not citizens themselves that have kids here, and the kids are citizens because of that particular clause that's there.
I want to thank you also very much for the lecture, but I want to push a bit more on the amendments and then ask a larger question.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the 15th Amendment,
Mm-hmm.
I teach African American and constitutional history.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, what holds is what U.S. versus Reese, that there is no positive right.
No what?
There is no positive right
Right.
to
Right.
vote
Right.
in the 15th Amendment.
Right.
Rather, it says that there are bases on which you may not prevent a person
Mm-hmm.
from voting. This is how we get the literacy clause, the grandfather clause, the poll tax, etc. So I am concerned, especially since we're dealing with education, about two things in particular. First of all, how do you take critical race theory, which would point out such things as the lack of a positive right in the 15th Amendment, and would point out the convergence thesis that when things are in the self-interest of whites and they happen to be civil rights, then they are passed. But if they fail to be in the interest of whites at the time, they do not pass.
Right.
So our educators, of course we don't insist that people take civics, but our educators are the persons on whom our young people are relying to understand about the full scope of their, not only their citizenship, but the meaning of the franchise for themselves. And it seems to me that there is a need for schools of education, classes in education, to begin to address critical race theory so that when they are talking about those rights, they're able to say clearly that you can also trace a very inegalitarian tradition in the United States. Here they share certain principles that are Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner and all, but there are many places where those values are not shared.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm asking about where critical race theory could come into education. And then I wanted to ask one other question, and that is just about your opinion. I used to be in conversation with Jamin Raskin about a proposed constitutional amendment for education. We don't have a right to education.
No, we don't.
Rodriguez, we don't have a right to education.
Yep.
So what do you think about, is there a need for a constitutional amendment?
I think so. In fact, I have a colleague who's doing a book on education as a human right, and I would support that very strongly. We do need not only an amendment covering education, but covering it in such a way that it actually provision for equal rights and equal opportunity education. Because we know with the Rodriguez case, for instance, in Texas, I mean, they said it was an accident of birth. You were born in a property-poor district. This is a property-rich district, and there's nothing the Constitution can do about it. The only way you can rectify that is that if the state mandates equality of education, then we can hold the state to its mandate. I think New Jersey is one of the states where they call for equal education, but most of the states do not call for that. Illinois does not call for that. They leave it to the states to distribute the fund in ways that they want to without regard to this issue of equality. And the only way to get states to respect that is, in fact, to have a constitutional amendment on equal education rights. I think the other thing, critical race theory is an interesting one here, and I think it's just, this whole thing is replete for that, because one of the things to think about is that there could have been a convergence of interest between a Republican-dominated Congress and the rise of a Republican African-American majority in states like Louisiana and Mississippi and South Carolina, and a very large, because you had at that time the formation of black Republican parties, for instance. So you could see a convergence of interest where but what I think happens is that they recognize that they would be voted out of office by their constituency if they had passed these amendments. And Thaddeus Stevens said he had done a survey and he thought there were only 5 states would vote for this amendment. And that within those states, in particular where he was, Pennsylvania, wouldn't vote for it, and that they would get voted out of office if they extended the franchise to black people. So in some ways, there was almost a convergence of interest, and then you saw it unravel for fear of their own political careers. But I think it's really ripe for a critical race theory analysis in terms of what's happening at this time.
Thank you.
Any last questions? Or a question, probably one last question? Yeah.
Well, I just had a quick thought with all this amazing research that you've done with this history. Are there material, I currently work with middle schoolers in a homeschool co-op, and I'm wondering if you're aware of, or if there's any plans to develop, any kind of materials that would help educators, bring more of these questions to light in a classroom environment to help spawn some of these kinds of conversations among our youth as well as this not only historic understanding but a current analysis of the issues we're facing.
Here's what I would do if I have the time, and I don't have the time. But I've always thought about this. I thought about actually being in the first grade, and I was in a play, and I still remember the play. And there are some things that young people always remember. And there's so much drama in these debates that if you actually had a literary person to commit it to plays for young people, well, they would assume the role of Thaddeus Stevens or the role of the others, and it would be in the form of a play, because they wouldn't have any difficulty grasping the meaning of it. I mean, I didn't quote some of the other people like Garrett Davis from Kentucky who said, let's make this clear, this is a white man's nation and no one else should be part of the body politic. And then you have Sumner over here. And Stevens more of a moderate. There is, and I have a copy of it, that Charles Sumner spoke for 4 hours on the floor of the Senate for equality in the Constitution. And it was just interesting because it was I always say it's the most learned speech on the floor of the House ever. And it's just amazing. And I actually got this from Du Bois in Black Reconstruction when he says that Sumner gave the Magna Charta of democracy. And I was like, what do you mean by this? Democracy was long before Sumner, until you read that. So there's plenty of material there. The other thing, and in fact, you actually mentioned this as well, is that I think I knew that there were interest in extending the voting rights to women at the time, but I didn't realize how extensive it was until you read all the petitions that are coming into Sumner and other cities, and when women are saying, look, now that you're at this, now that you're going to create a more liberal constitution and equal rights for everyone and voting rights for everyone, petitions are coming in all over the place. These petitions they could use to recognize that. And then the speeches that they make with regard to Chinese, I mean, the main concern they had, first they were raising the question as to whether Chinese could be citizens. And they decided that the population was so small that was okay. But then they moved to make sure that they could not be part of the Naturalization Act. The fear was that the Chinese would take over California and prohibit whites from being dominant in those states. And so you have the whole of America, Native Americans, African Americans, women, Chinese, in this debate, in a way. Gypsies, I mean, that's a pejorative term, but that's the term they were using at the time. Gypsies, I go, why are they concerned about gypsies not being citizens of the United States? And the congressional representatives from Pennsylvania were saying we cannot have them. Well, California said, we've never heard of gypsies. What are you talking about? And what is a gypsy? And the guy gave a definition. He says, well, they show up, and when they leave, all your possessions are gone. That's who they are. You get these kinds of things in there. There's humor, there's tragedy, there's drama. If we could commit this to plays where kids, middle school and other places, could actually act out their Constitution and see how meaningful it is for what they do, whether it's on voting, whether it's on equal protection, whether it's on any number of issues, I think it would have a lasting impact. I mean, civics, as we traditionally do it, is one way, but I think we have to think about other ways of doing it. And certainly for me, sometimes the literary has a more profound impact. And I'll just give one example from James Baldwin. And a lot of people, including myself, have struggled to kind of understand Jim Crow and to explain it to people. And it's not easy to explain, particularly when you grow up in it. But James Baldwin came to Selma for the March on Selma and was arrested 3 times in the first day. He wasn't trying to get arrested. He kept making mistakes because he's not from the South, not from Alabama. And I'm still trying to find it. He wrote this thing. He says, Jim Crow is like a thick carpet laid over thousands of loose wires. And you have to learn to walk across the carpet without touching a loose wire. And I had never seen a historian come close to understanding Jim Crow in that way. And I was like, yeah, that's the one I grew up in. Because he recognized in his literary analysis, it wasn't about the law. It's the unwritten rules that he was arrested. And all those loose wires, unwritten rules. Rosa Parks herself, she didn't break a law. She was sitting in her part of the bus. The unwritten rule was that if all of the seats for whites were filled up, then they could take your seat. And she said no. So that's just scores upon scores of that. I've never seen a scholar come close to. And when I read James Baldwin, I said, that's it. Now historians need to take it and run with it and explain all of those wires underneath this carpet and the challenge of growing up in that kind of society and not stepping on one of them like Emmett Till did.